to meet, I'm Dewey Gordon, one of your two event chairs, as well as the Israel Action Chair at Temple Israel for the last 2 decades, and it's truly an honor to stand before you. On behalf of my fellow event co-chair, Heidi Lehner, and myself, Boker Tov and Bruchim Habayim, good morning and welcome to our 4th annual Jewish National Metro West Breakfast. Woohoo! Amazing to see a sea of smiling faces and passionate Zionists here. On behalf of to our distinguished speaker, Chloé. That's enough. We don't need Valdary. Chloé, we are thrilled to have you here with us today. As I mentioned, back in 2015, you were on my wish list to bring as a speaker, so I'm elated that it came to be. Thank you, JNF. Okay, we have more than many important guests I want to recognize and thank them personally. So we ask that you hold your applause to the end. Our own beloved Rabbi Daniel Levin, JNF Executive Director Sarah Hefez, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Gali Gordon, not present, my superstar son in Wave of Joy, who has been rooting from Cafe Rothschild in Melbourne this morning, wearing his JNF t-shirt. Gali grew up here at Temple Israel, and he came up with the idea of having a Metro West Jewish National Fund breakfast. That's become a brunch today. I'm not sure what the difference is, but hey, that's fine. And for 3 years, he had this idea that we'd have a father-son collaboration. So we did 3 wonderful years of having a collaboration together. And I'm thrilled that Sarah Hefez, his mentor and director, stepped up to the plate to help create this event here this morning. Now please direct your attention to the screens for a moving Jewish National Fund video. Thank you.
Since 1901, Jewish National Fund has made its mark all across the land of Israel. JNF built communities where there once was only sand, found water solutions for an arid land, created jobs throughout the country, and turned the desert green. Every footprint that Jewish National Fund makes, that you make, starts with a strategic vision of a better future for Israel, its people, and the Jewish people everywhere. These footprints tell the stories of Israel's rich history and create a path for the Jewish leaders of tomorrow to follow. In the North, we are changing the narrative to entice people to move and create a home for tomorrow's generations.
The entire region is coming to life through food, agriculture, tourism. This is the place to be.
Look at this place. My business is thriving. It means that more people have jobs, and we have the chance to live in this beautiful place. What can be better?
In the center of Israel, our footprint helps immigrants new and old. Nefesh Ben Nefesh helps Olim launch their new lives in Israel.
When I made Aliyah, this hub helped ease my transition into living in Israel. It helped me build a community, find a job, and make friends. I can't thank you enough.
On the border with Gaza, JNF went where no man had set foot before, and from sand, created life.
JNF's footprint is everywhere. You helped us build medical center, greenhouses, kindergartens, daycare centers, women business centers, playgrounds, synagogues, and much more. All that to keep our Zionist future and spirit alive.
In the Arava Valley, deep in the Negev Desert, we have become a world leader in agricultural and environmental innovations.
You helped us turn even the most barren region into fruitful farmland.
In the Negev Desert, we are creating a new sound.
Ben-Gurion had a dream that Beersheba will become the capital of the South. Jewish National Fund has made Ben-Gurion's vision a reality.
With every footstep, every blueprint, every vision and development, Jewish National Fund paints the entire canvas of Israel with vibrant, pioneering colors. We live our values by helping those in need. In the greater Sderot area, we provide young people with resilience centers and a safe place to simply be kids, away from the trauma. We provide educational opportunities for youth of all ages and prepare them to be the Jewish leaders of tomorrow at our semester abroad high school in Israel. We have made a home for the heroes who safeguard the region. And we are not stopping. Soon, the Air Sheva will become home to the great conversations of Israel's future, of our future. The JNF Israel Education and Technology Campus will leave the largest footprint of them all as it prepares our youth to lead the Jewish community of tomorrow. Be a part. Leave your footprint in Israel with us. Jewish National Fund. We are unique, we are strategic, we are visionary. And we've been that way since 1901. Join us.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, friends, for being here on a Sunday morning. We know it isn't easy to come out here on a Sunday morning, but you've done it. And with your efforts, we now have a full house of people united in our support of Jewish National Fund and, more importantly, in Israel. My name is Dar Nadler, and I'm the Jewish National Fund Israel emissary to New England. I relocated from Israel a year and a half ago to fulfill the mission of enhancing and growing the support of Americans in the state of Israel and JNF to try and bring an authentic Israeli voice to this most sacred mission of all, and this to bring us, American Jews and Israelis, closer together. But first, I want to take this opportunity to thank our dearest Dubi for the incredible work you're doing every year in pulling together this breakfast and making JNF present in the Metro West community. Guys, JNF truly relies on lay leaders like Dubi. Dubi, if you can please stand up. I also want to thank our co-chair, Heidi Lanier, for her, I would say, big time joining our JNF family. Thank you, Heidi. So, singular in the Jewish philanthropic world, JNF's strategic vision to build and connect the land of Israel today and tomorrow is unparalleled. Since 1901, JNF's driving focus has been to ensure a strong, secure, and prosperous land of Israel for the Jewish people everywhere. Everything we do, every project, initiative, every campaign we take on connects to our vision and mission. JNF don't just build houses. We don't just buy fire trucks. We don't just plant trees. We don't just provide therapeutic assistance. We don't just boost tourism, medical centers, fund research, or run an American semester abroad high school in Israel. No. Everything we do plays an integral role in implementing our vision, population growth in the north and south of Israel, and connecting the next generation of American Jews to the land and to the state of Israel. We are providing bomb shelters and resilience centers to the citizens that are living on the Gaza border and are suffering from ongoing missiles attacks. We are building new communities in the Negev and the Galilee, and we are strengthening existing ones. We are investing in job opportunities in the periphery. We take extra care of Israel's ecology and water solution. We build infrastructure, we preserve history heritage sites, and we don't leave anyone behind. We take care of people with special needs and disabilities too. We are shaping a strong yet moral Israel, just as was intended by our Zionist founding fathers and mothers. Now, as we all know here in this room, the mission of growing the support in Israel is getting harder and harder. The division between Israel and American Jews had hit a point that is unprecedented. Anti-Semitism is thriving even in the US, and sometimes it feels like there's just too much evil and complexities in simply being a Jew. However, this is why it's more crucial than ever before to support the state of Israel and to stand united as Jews. Israel will always be the very essence of the Jewish people. It's our homeland, it's our safe haven. JNF, unlike any other organization, is giving you, us, the most effective way to be involved in Israel's present and future without being politically affiliated. It gives us the way to influence without interfering. By supporting JNF, you are shaping the next 70 years of Israel. You have a say in what directions Israel is going. Think about it. It's such a privilege to have. As an Israeli, it's important for me to say that Israel belongs to all of us, those that live in Israel and those that live in the diaspora, belongs to all of us. We can think about it, as I like to say, as the Jewish headquarters of all of us. As far as I'm concerned, I see you all as family, as a close family. And like in all families, we're not always in agreement, but we always, always, always stick together. This morning, I invite you to show your commitment to JNF and to the bond between you and me, between American and Israelis. I want to offer that we'll drill it down to people and just avoid politics altogether. So, if you have never made a gift to Jewish National Fund before, make the day you joined our family. Just so you know, last year, we had 60% of the people sitting in this room making a gift, 68%. Guys, let's make it 100%. Please join me now in taking your pledge cards and just make your most generous gift. As you can all see, hi Margie, we have our adorable Hebrew school students are providing you with flags. One, two, three. Keep going.
Thank you.
So guys, just thank you all for being here and thank you all for making this a priority. It's really never for granted. And now, just help me, please. Help me, join me in welcoming our co-chair of this event, Heidi Linear.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's now my privilege to introduce you to a rising young leader. She is a passionate thought leader who is taking her innovative theory of change, the theory of enchantment, from the nonprofit sector to the corporate world, combining the psychology of persuasion with profound insights from household names and pop culture. Chloé's theory of enchantment is a philosophy that can help change agents and corporate leaders navigate an increasingly polarized world and help untap human potential along the way. She is an accomplished writer who served as the Tikva Fellow under Pulitzer Prize winner Bret Stephens at the Wall Street Journal and has written for and published op-eds in the New York Times, Atlantic Magazine, the Times of Israel, and Commentary Magazine. Her work has been covered in the LA Review of Books. And she is a proud Zionist who was the Director of Partnerships and Shillman Fellow at Jerusalem U, a nonprofit organization dedicated to film-based Jewish and Israel education. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome activist, author, and proud Zionist, Chloé Valdary.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It is a real privilege to do an event with JNF. I love coming to speak at JNF events. Actually, on Friday, I was in a meeting with Russell Robinson in the JNF headquarters in New York. So it's always a pleasure to greet audiences and supporters of JNF when I tour around the country speaking about Israel and Zionism. Some of you may be wondering who I am, though, and how I got here and what my story is. So I'm originally from New Orleans, Louisiana. I was born and raised in New Orleans. I grew up in a very atypical Christian family. I grew up as a Christian observing Shabbat and keeping kosher style and keeping all the holy days, which was extremely odd. Very odd upbringing. It means that I did not get the pleasure to enjoy oysters or crawfish in New Orleans. So if you have any questions about that food experience, I'm afraid I can't tell you about that. Sorry. So that's one experience I had. But another interesting experience I had was my parents and the church that I attended did not have an additional text to the literal Torah to help us interpret how to actually observe certain holy days. So as I'm sure you know, in the Orthodox tradition, for example, the observance of Sukkot, let's say, you build a sukkah, it has a very specific, borders and such. You go there and you read Kohelet. This is how one observes Sukkot in the Orthodox Jewish tradition. Well, my parents did not have all of the additional text, and so in the Torah it simply says to stay in a temporary dwelling place. And, we interpreted that in a very contemporary way, and my parents and the church that I attended decided to go to Florida and stay in condos, which was our temporary dwelling place. So that was my experience growing up. And so as you can imagine, I developed a very strong affinity for Jews and for Jewish culture as a result of that experience. And it made me very sensitive to anti-Semitism. And so once I got to college, I initially majored in film, but switched majors because anti-Semitism was resurfacing in Europe at the time. This was around 2011, 2012. And specifically in places like France. And I thought that it was important that my generation combat that. And so I switched majors. I majored in international studies. I started a student pro-Israel organization on campus called Allies of Israel. I did Israel advocacy for roughly 8.5 years, from the time I was in school to the time that I moved to New York, and did some work at the Wall Street Journal. But that is my background. And so once I got to New York, and I was at the Wall Street Journal. I worked for Bret Stephens for a year. And the first 3 months I was working on writing for the paper. But the remaining 9 months I worked on a thesis entitled Israel Advocacy and Millennials: What Works, What Doesn't, and How to Make It Better. And it was in that paper that I was trying to sort of crack a code and answer the question of how to cultivate affinity for Israel among the millennial generation, among my generation. And I discovered 2 important things that have shaped the course of my career ever since. The first is that there is a difference between asking the question, how do you combat hatred, and how do you get people to love? These are 2 different questions. They're very interrelated questions, but they are not the same questions. That's the first thing I discovered. And with that came the realization that if I wanted to get people to learn how to love, I would have to actually ask, well, what are we already in love with as a generation, as a society? And for me, the answer to that question was pop culture. Pop culture showed us the things that we gravitated toward as a society. And so the question for me was, could I look into pop culture and develop a psychology to teach people how to love based upon the things that we love, based upon the fact that we love, for example, Disney movies, and based upon the fact that we gravitate toward pop culture artists like Beyonce. Was there a common denominator between the things that we love and a psychology that I could then take from that to teach people how to love on college campuses and beyond? So that was the big aha moment that I sort of discovered as a result of my research. And the other aha moment was that as I began to lecture about this on college campuses after being at the Wall Street Journal, I discovered that there was a framework that was teaching people how to have animosity with each other, actually. in the name of social justice. It was a framework that was teaching people that in order to achieve righteous ends, that we needed to not be empathetic with each other, but to be hostile with each other, to prejudge one another based upon skin color or gender or socioeconomic status or national origin in the name of social justice. This is what I discovered was being taught on college campuses. And I thought to myself, in order to combat that, I needed to create a framework that taught people not how to be hostile with one another, but taught people how to love. And that is something that must be taught. It's not something that can be taken for granted. It's not something that we're necessarily born knowing how to do. Teaching people how to love is something that must be taught. And so as a result, I developed a approach, a framework, if you will, called the theory of enchantment that does exactly that, that teaches people how to love. And so this morning I want to walk you through what that looks like and how it pertains specifically to how we deal with difficult questions that arise as Zionists and as pro-Israel activists when they come up, whether it's on social media or in the classroom. How do we deal with hostile environments? How do we confront one another? What's the framework that we should walk into the room with in order to bring about a better outcome of getting people to love? So if we could get the presentation up and get that started, that'd be perfect. So there are 3 principles of the theory of enchantment. And so I'm going to go through them very quickly, but as you will see, I'll walk you through how they apply to this particular topic of Israel and Zionism and the difficult conversations we have to navigate. So, principle 1, and you will notice that this is universally applicable. Remember that Israelis and Palestinians are human beings, not political abstractions. Principle 2, criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy. And principle 3, root everything you do in love and compassion. Now, these may seem like very simple principles, and to be fair, they are. But again, this takes practice to really internalize and then to set the tone in any room and any environment that we go into. So, fast. So, what does it mean that we're human beings? You may be thinking, well, of course we're human beings. Chloé, we're not trees. We're not, objects. Of course we're human beings. But actually, what I have discovered is that we take for granted the fact that we're human beings. We take for granted the complexity of the human condition and the fact that we are all imperfect. So a corollary of principle 1 is that understanding that we are human beings requires an intimate understanding of what it actually means to be human. We are complicated, we are flawed, we are imperfect, and yet we are capable of redemption. And as we acknowledge our own humanity, we acknowledge our mutual capacity to build and to destroy, to uplift and to tear down. And by recognizing this potential within ourselves and within one another, we can begin to lay the foundation for empathy. So, I mentioned earlier that pop culture is very pervasive throughout the theory of enchantment. And the reason is because I think we can learn something about ourselves by seeing the things that we gravitate towards. So I want to just demonstrate that for you for a very quick second. So I just want to know, by show of hands, who in the room knows who Kendrick Lamar is? Okay, a good size, good size. So for those of you who aren't aware, Kendrick Lamar is considered one of the greatest living hip-hop legends of all time. He was the first hip-hop artist to win the Pulitzer Prize for hip-hop, which was a very, big deal. And one of his famous songs is called DNA. And in DNA, he says, "I got power, poison, pain, and joy inside my DNA." It's one of the great lines in that song. And what's beautiful about that line, in addition to the fact that it's full of alliteration, is that he is articulating the complexity of what it means to be a human being. He is saying that he is imperfect, and he is self-aware enough to acknowledge his imperfection. He is acknowledging the fact that he is able to build people up and to tear people down. And by being self-aware enough to know that, he's able to then make the right choices as he moves along in this very difficult world. So that's just one simple example of how the complexity of the human condition is captured in pop culture and captured in the zeitgeist. And I always tell students that when you are consuming pop culture, you should consume it actively, not passively. Because oftentimes, these artists and influencers are trying to teach us important things about life and important things about ourselves. Another additional idea that goes with the first principle, again, which is remember that we are human beings, not political abstractions, is understanding the concept of breaking the fourth wall. Do I have any theater people here? Okay, so some of you may know what breaking the fourth wall is in the context of theater. It's when the actor ceases from acting on stage and begins to talk to the audience. That's what breaking the fourth wall is. But in the context of theory of enchantment, breaking the fourth wall is the realization that the internal mechanisms that are at work within you are also at work within someone you're in conflict with. So, for example, if you know that when you are feeling insecure about something, if you know that you have a tendency to get defensive, like I have a tendency to get defensive sometimes when I feel insecure, me being self-aware enough to recognize that, if I encounter someone who may be, let's say, anti-Zionist, and who's getting defensive in their arguments with me, it may be that, in fact, they are feeling insecure, right? And so breaking the fourth wall is, again, a mirroring effect. It's the realization that those emotions that are within us are actually informing our behavior. And so to expand on this, I'm going to show you a clip of Jay-Z talking about this within the context of his own life and lived experience. Because again, this is about bringing the lessons of pop culture and using it in our everyday life to approach conflict in a productive way.
Every emotion is connected and comes from somewhere. And just being aware of it in everyday life puts you at such an advantage. You know, you realize that, you know, if someone's racist toward you, it's not even about you. It ain't about you. It's about their upbringing and what happened to them and how they led them to this point. You know, most bullies bully. It's happened. Oh, you got bullied as a kid, so you're trying to bully me. I understand.
Right.
And once I understand that, instead of reacting to that with anger, I can provide a softer landing. And maybe, oh man, are you okay? I was just saying, there was a lot of fights in our neighborhood that started with, what you looking at? Why you looking at me? You looking at me? And then you realize, oh, you think I see you. You're in the space where you're hurting and you think I see you, so you don't want me to look at you. And you don't want me to see you in such a vulnerable, you don't want me to see your pain. You don't, so you put on this shell of this tough person that's really willing to fight me and possibly kill me because I looked at you. You know what I'm saying? Like, so knowing that and understanding that changes life completely.
So now we can begin to see why this first principle, which again is very simple, is also extremely foundational. And sometimes we forget in our political conversations and the debates we sometimes have back and forth, certainly I'll speak for myself on social media, that the people we are speaking to are people, and they are bringing the complexity of what it means to be a human being with them. And we have to keep that in mind about ourselves and about the people we engage with as we try to cultivate an environment of love and not of hostility. So, the second principle, to remind you, was criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down, never to destroy. Now, this principle is all about guarding our intentions, even when we are critical, and rooting our intention in the desire to see the subject of our criticism empowered creates a totally new experience of critique. The purpose of criticism should always be to empower others to do better, not to tear them down. And any community that is steeped in bigotry harms not only the people they persecute, but also themselves. Now you can see how this would be extremely applicable to some of the conversations we have to navigate as Zionists. When folks criticize Israel, when we criticize Palestinian society, for example, we have to make sure that we set a tone that notifies the people that we're talking to that our criticism is rooted in good intentions, that we are criticizing bad behavior because we want the best for the people that we're criticizing. And likewise, we should demand that when other folks criticize Israelis or Israeli society, which, we all do, again, we're human beings, this is life, but do so in order to uplift Israelis and empower Israelis, not to tear them down and not to destroy them. So 2 examples, one from pop culture and one from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The first example is a true story of the poet Maya Angelou's experience with the hip-hop artist Tupac. The story goes that they were on the same film set one day, and Maya Angelou, who, is this very graceful woman, sees Tupac down the corner, or down the hall rather, and he's sort of getting into a physical altercation or a verbal altercation with another human being, another person on set, sort of cursing under his breath, doing all of these very irate things. Obviously, Maya Angelou doesn't like what she's seeing. And she says to him, "Come over here, let me talk to you, let me talk to you." And he continues to mumble under his breath, And she says, "Come over here, let me talk to you, let me talk to you." And finally he comes over and she says, "Don't you know that you are the generation that my generation is looking toward to move us into the future? Don't you know that we are looking to you as the next model for us, for our lives?" Imagine Maya Angelou, who comes from an incredible generation of civil rights leaders and Harlem Renaissance poets, coming up to you and saying, "We are looking to you to lead us into the future." And then she proceeds to criticize his behavior, but rooted in that belief in his potential. And so the story goes that immediately in the very next moment, Tupac started to cry. Because no one had ever criticized him with the intent to uplift him and to empower him. And the very next day, Tupac hasn't resolved his issues with this other guy on set, but as soon as he sees Maya Angelou walking through the hallway, he straightens up and he says, "Good morning, Miss Angelou." His behavior immediately changes, right? That's change as a result of a form of criticism that was rooted in the belief in his potential. And that is what the second principle is really trying to get at. So this is from a letter that the Israeli national poet Amos Oz wrote to his Palestinian friend at the time, which is also a brilliant example of an articulation of the second principle. He said, "No, my friend, I have not forgotten the fact that hundreds of thousands of you are still rotting in miserable refugee camps. Of course it is hard for you, but alas, it is quite hard for us Israelis to get killed every day. We aren't strong enough, you say, but it is not just your strength which must be put to the test now. It is first and foremost your courage and integrity. Where are today the Palestinian mass rallies against murder and in favor of peace? Where is today a Palestinian peace now? Where are your intellectuals, public opinion makers, clerics, and poets?" Notice, Oz does not criticize in order to tear down the person he's criticizing. He does not criticize this person by telling them that they are nothing, by telling them that they are worthless. He criticizes them by saying that they are capable of more, that they are capable of better, and by saying that he actually believes in that capacity and believes in that potential. Now I'm going to tell you a story about what happens when the second principle is not applied, and very terrible things happen as a result. Has anyone in this room heard the story of Wafa al-Bis? Or know who she is? Okay, so Wafa al-Bis was a young woman who, during the Second Intifada, attempted to blow herself up at a checkpoint. She would have harmed the lives of innocent Israelis as a result. Now, when she did this attempt, it was a failed attempt, but when she did this attempt, all across the Arab world, There were papers, newspapers, that heralded her as a hero, as a would-be martyr. But in point of fact, beyond the noise and the fanfare, what was actually going on behind the scenes told a very different story. When Israeli authorities brought in members of the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which had recruited her to do that deed, and they brought in her parents, they interrogated them, and they said, what was the impulse? What was the motivation? And at first they kept saying, oh, she was a martyr for the cause, she was anti-Zionist, she wanted to sacrifice herself for the land, etc. The usual thing. But as they kept digging deeper and deeper, the true story was revealed. And it turns out that Wafa al-Bis had been very much abused by her father for a month and a half. She had attempted to commit suicide twice prior to this suicide bombing attempt. And this third attempt was actually, in addition to having been, it was going to harm innocent people, it was also an attempt to extinguish her life from the face of the earth. And Maya Angelou has this quote. She says, when you tell people that they are nothing, that they are less than nothing, that they account for nothing, they say to themselves, oh, you think I am nothing? I will show you where nothing is. And they will become even worse than what you have accused them of being. And the moral of the story is that a person cannot, and I cannot stress this enough, a person cannot develop character unless they are valued. So all of the social change that we, really promote and really advocate for, all of the social change that we want to happen in the world, and then particularly as it relates to combating anti-Semitism and promoting Zionism, we have to do that type of work with the understanding that a person and a society and a community will not develop character unless it is valued and unless it is loved. And this is something that we can forget, again, in the noise of animosity. We can forget it when we're going back and forth, and again, I'm speaking for myself here, when we're going back and forth on social media, as I often do. But it is important to root our advocacy in these principles. Because not only, if we don't do it, not only will we not be as effective as we could be, but if we don't do it, we could also end up making things worse. So that's the second principle. Criticize to uplift and empower, never to tear down and never to destroy. And finally, the last principle. Root everything you do in love and compassion. This means that when we are attacked with negative rhetoric, we respond by calling that rhetoric out as unacceptable and harmful, but then we invite that person who has attacked us to break bread with us. And the purpose of this is not to come to an agreement, but to reintroduce compassion and empathy, even in the midst of profound disagreement. Obviously, as you can imagine, it is very difficult to invite someone to break bread with you who has just said bad things to you, who has just attacked you pejoratively, who has just called you this, that, and the other name that I will not and cannot repeat on this stage. It is a very difficult act to then say to that person, what you have done is unacceptable and mean-spirited, but in a spirit of compassion and in the spirit of empathy, I want to invite you to come get coffee with me, come to Shabbat dinner with me, come get a drink with me, so we can talk things out. Because what matters, again, is not agreement. I'm sure many of us in this room disagree on a myriad of issues related to Israel and other topics. The point is not agreement. The point is to create a framework and an environment of compassion and empathy, even in the midst of profound disagreement, and to nurture that relationship. And as a result, what we do when we do this is we contribute to creating what Dr. King once called the beloved community. And your example of unconditional love and empathy will be necessary for those around you to see you and to see what you are modeling. So, a couple of quick stories that illustrate the third principle. A couple years ago, at the University of Florida, there was a white nationalist that came to speak. And as you can imagine, there was a protest that ensued outside the door where this white nationalist was speaking, and a young man named Randy Furness, who identified as a Nazi, wanted to go see the white nationalist speak. But in order to do so, he had to move through the sea of protesters. And once he got through the sea of protesters, he was beat up, he was punched, he was called names, and as he was making his way through the sea of protesters, one young man, an African-American man by the name of Aaron Courtney, saw him, and for some reason was not moved to punch him, and was not moved to curse him out, but he did the only thing that moved him in that moment, which is to say that he hugged him. And he pulled him close, and he asked him simply 3 times, "Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me? Why do you hate me?" And it was as if time stopped. And as you can imagine, Randy Furness didn't know what was going on at that moment, and he simply responded by saying, "I don't know." And he hugged him back. And that sparked a series of conversations between Randy Furness and Aaron Courtney and other members of the African American community. And since then, Randy Furness has been working on changing himself and changing the way he relates to the world as a result of that act of love and that act of kindness, which Aaron Courtney did not have to show him, but he chose to show him. And as a result, that led to profound change. This is an example that is directly related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Muslim Leadership Initiative, which was an initiative that was started by an Israeli author, Yossi Klein Halevi, which some of you may be familiar with, and a Muslim imam here in America. This initiative takes Muslims and flies them over to Israel, young Muslims, young American Muslims, so they can learn about Zionism. Not so that they will necessarily become Zionists at the end of this initiative, but so that they will understand Zionism, and that they will understand it from the Jewish perspective, and why it is so important to the Jewish community, and why it has been such a motivator and inspiration to the Jewish community. And again, that reiterates the point that I made earlier about the objective not being necessarily to foster perfect agreement, but to foster compassion and empathy, even in the midst of profound disagreement. Another organization is called Roots, a Path to Reconciliation. This was co-founded also by an Israeli and a Palestinian. And it's very profound because it was co-founded by an Israeli who considers himself to be a settler, and a Palestinian who formerly was associated with organizations that were friendly to terrorist groups. And I just want to read to you the statements from each of these individuals that they made as a result of rooting their advocacy in love and compassion and making space for one another. So Ali Abu Awad is a Palestinian peace activist, and he said, "An Israeli mother who lost her son held my mother's hand, and both of them cried wordlessly. It was the first time in my life," remember that first principle, we are human beings, not political abstractions. "It was the first time in my life that I saw the other side as human beings. I saw different representatives of the Jewish people, of Judaism, and of Israelis. It had a huge impact on me." And Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger, who's a Jewish settler and peace activist and also a co-founder of Roots, he said, "To meet the other, to bring the other into my soul, to identify with the other, I had to make room in my soul for another truth, the Palestinian truth. That doesn't make my connection to this land any less strong or true, but it has to be balanced by an understanding of another truth." So both of these individuals made space for each other, and they made space to have love and compassion for each other. I think it is one of the most profound discoveries to hear Ali Abu Awad say that for the first time he saw the other as a human being. What a revelation. We take this revelation for granted. We do this in our everyday lives. We abstract about strangers walking down the street, let alone about people in a conflict hundreds of miles away. This is human nature. But imagine the new world that he walked into once he saw someone that he had previously seen as an enemy as a human being. It's a profound change. And every time I see that scene, I can't help but think of this image, and I can't help but think of this image when she says, "They have stolen the heart from inside you, but this does not define you." And so that ability that we have as human beings to change, to discover our potential, to be renewed in our sense of potential, and to greet one another, even though previously we were enmeshed in bitterness and discord and hostility, to greet one another anew with love and compassion is, I think, the fundamental project and the fundamental task that we now have, especially as we see anti-Semitism rise, unfortunately, in our country, and as we see anti-Israel animosity rise in our country. This is the central task, and it is a difficult task because it is easier to respond to hatred with hatred. It is easier to respond to discrimination with discrimination. But this is the more difficult task. It is the more noble task to respond with love. So this is a theory of enchantment. I thank you so much for being an incredible audience. And I don't know if we have time for Q&A, but thank you. Okay. So we have time for 2 questions. 2, just 2. Was it going to be? Yes.
Yes. All right, thank you for your speech. My name is Louis Shanker. I am a student at UMass Amherst. I'm just going to give a little bit of brief context to my question. So I'm a vocal Zionist, a proud Jew. I live at the Chabad off campus. And on November 12th, this past semester, there was a BDS panel titled Criminalizing Dissent. It had speakers like Omar Barghouti, live via Skype from Ramallah. Linda Sarsour was the moderator. And after I vocalized my criticism of the panelists and their anti-Semitic rhetoric, 4 days later, I was arrested at the Amherst Chabad and brought to the Hampshire County Jail, placed in solitary confinement for 56 hours with little food or water. And as a result of this, over 1,800 BDS activists have signed a letter alleging that I am a Nazi, despite being the grandson of Holocaust survivors. Now, unfortunately, in your lovely presentation, you mentioned Mr. Ali Abu Awad. Now, he is a vocal supporter of the BDS movement who has been supportive of these members who want my death and the destruction of many of the people in this community and my family in Israel. So my question to you, ma'am, would be, how do you square the principles of your thesis and presentation while using examples of these enemies of the Jewish people and people that seek my destruction, not from a level of compassion and understanding, but virulent hatred?
So I first want to say I'm so sorry for that experience. I would recommend, by the way, that you get in touch with an organization, if you haven't already, called the Lawfare Project, which can represent you legally to get the legal help that you need and possibly sue the school if possible. So that's the first thing I'll say. I'll also say that it's been my understanding that Ali Abu Awad, by definition, I mean, maybe something has changed since this presentation, but by definition doesn't support the BDS movement because he created an organization that's all about creating reconciliation and promoting reconciliation with Israelis, specifically Israelis in the West Bank. Now, it's possible that something has changed, and if that's true, I'll have to look into that. But I don't think the underlying message changes, even if he's changed his political position. Now, to the greater question, and it's a good question, of how my principles can be applied when people are attacking you and trying to harm you, let me tell you a story from my personal experience. And it's the experience of my people. And you can choose to use it as an example or not. But it's a true story. And I think it is insightful and provides a lot of the frameworks that I use in approaching these types of issues when it comes to racism and discrimination. So as you may know, during the civil rights movement, when my people were holding sit-ins in the South, where they were not allowed to sit because they were black, they would sit in knowing that they would be not just verbally attacked, but physically attacked. But before they decided to sit in, they would go through these training exercises where they would study things like stoicism to practice emotional regulation. And they would study these things not because they didn't have a desire initially to fight back against the people that were attacking them. They had every desire in the world to do so. But they decided that their weapons were going to be different. So what I'm saying to you is that I'm not telling the people in this room not to fight. I'm telling the people in this room to diversify your weapons. And so when the people in the civil rights movement were practicing with their weapons, the way that they practiced was they knew that once they went into the diners, they knew that they would be spit upon, they knew that they would have their hair pulled, they knew that they would be pummeled physically, and they trained themselves to physically not fight back. Spiritually, they were fighting back. But by engaging in a fight of nonviolence in the South, they were saying two things. They were saying we will use nonviolence as a weapon, as a measure of fighting, and our internal state will be that no matter what our enemies wish for us, despite the harm that our enemies wish for us, we do not and will not stoop to the level of our enemies and wish them harm in return. That is a very specific framework that takes spiritual fortitude and courage, and it is possible that you may choose to not go this route, and that is your choice. But this measure on the part of these people during the civil rights movement who did that, who went into the diners and who sat and who allowed themselves to be beat up without physically fighting back, was still a measure of fighting. It was still a kind of weapon. And so I want you to consider, and again, you are well within your right, and it is totally up to you to choose something else. But I want you to consider that fact, and I want you to consider that love is a weapon. It is not a passive thing. It was everything that Dr. King taught, and it is not a measure of being passive. It is not about letting people walk all over you. It is a weapon, but it is a weapon that seeks to change the hearts and minds of men and women, not just their bodies. So I want you to consider that as you navigate this difficult time, which is unbearably difficult. And I know because I experienced very similar things as a Zionist when I was on campus. I got death threats. I had to call the police several times to come to my house. So I know I'm not speaking from a place of inexperience. I'm speaking from a place of deeply rooted experience, but also a place of love. And I'm telling you that these methods that I used, in my experience, help change some people and help transform their lives. So it's up to you. It's a choice.